Hi, my name is Allison Arnold. I am the agriculture agent with Cooperative Extension here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains Practical Pollinator Habitats. Meghan Baker is a horticultural professional based in Asheville and the Small Farms Extension agent for Buncombe County Cooperative Extension. An avid naturalist and outdoor enthusiast, Megan holds certifications as a North Carolina environmental educator, a Southern Appalachian naturalist, and an interpretive guide. A native of Western North Carolina, she's deeply committed to sustaining the region's agricultural heritage and productive lands. Please join me in welcoming Megan Baker as she talks about how we as gardeners can support our pollinators. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Allison. Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to talk to you today about one of my most favorite topics, which are pollinators and their habitats. Most of the photos that you'll see today are my own images, but I do want to acknowledge other colleagues at NC State, Charlotte Glenn, who's our Master Gardener Program Director at the state. She has some lovely slides that I've been able to utilize, as well as Elsie Youngstead and Hannah Levinson, who are pollinator specialists at NC State. Just a quick introduction. If you are not familiar with cooperative extension, our job is to connect research based information at the university level through NC University and North Carolina State University and bring that information down to the local communities. As Allison mentioned, my job is to work with small farms in Buncombe County, and I help them troubleshoot issues. I help them develop production methodologies for new crops. That means I get to spend a lot of time in the field and seeing what's happening, which is amazing when you are talking about pollinators. We have a diversity of different types of small farms, fruits and vegetables and herbs, flowers, and that brings in a lot of diversity with the organisms that we see on the farm, including pollinators. So, before we dive into the plant side of pollinator habitat, it's important that we understand the foundation of what pollination is and who those players are in the pollination world. So, a quick review: pollination, when we mention that word, we're basically talking about moving male flower parts and pollen to the female flower parts, the stigma and stamen interactions. And when that pollen transfer occurs, whether that's through insects or other organisms, or in the cases of many of our grasses and gymnosperms, that's wind and water moving that pollen around. That is the basis of all plant life, is moving that pollen from the male parts to the female part, ensuring future generations of plants. And why do we need to talk about pollinators to begin with? They literally are the foundation of the entire ecological system. That's why. They are considered a keystone species, meaning that if you removed pollinators from any ecosystem, there would be negative consequences for many other organisms involved. We think a lot in terms of pollinators with our food consumption as humans, but to really capture the full magnitude of those organisms, you have to zoom out to the landscape level and the ecosystem level. So when pollinators are moving from one flower to the next, they are moving pollen around. And as I mentioned, that's critical for future generations of plants, for flowers, and for fruits and nuts. But it also is important in moving genetic material around. So we want genetic diversity in all things in life, and pollinators are behind that transfer and that abundance in the ecosystem. When plants are pollinated adequately, they often will fruit better, and that creates more food supply for all sorts of other organisms. And you can really go up the food chain from the tiniest insects that then become food for larger organisms. Many of you might be birding fans. Birds consume a great deal of insects, that's the bulk of their diet. Those birds then become food for other organisms and on up the food chain. So it really is important that we conserve and protect habitat for these organisms for this larger landscape level. In the lens of the small farm world, which is my work world, we very much rely upon pollinators for fruit sets and for food consumption. So if you go to the farmer's market or to the grocery store, it's estimated that every third bite of food that you are consuming from those initial resources is thanks to a pollinator. Up to 80% of the world's plants rely on pollinators to move pollen from one flower to the next. That translates into our agricultural system with higher yields, with the variety of fruits and abundance that we can have. And there are economic consequences if there are not enough pollinators. Many of you may know that in growing in indoor agricultural settings, there are humans and robots that use pollination services, whether it's through a Q-tip, moving manually one piece of pollen to the next flower over. It can be very laborious. And so when we talk about pollinators through the lens of agriculture, we think of what they offer as a really critical economic service. They through their basic biology, are collecting pollen and nectar from flowers. When they do that, they're moving that pollen around, which then creates more fruits and flowers for us to enjoy and consume. So it's very important for our food supply. The majority of our small farms, whether they know it or not, are creating a lot of pollinator habitat. So the picture that you see with the buckwheat summer cover crop on the left there is a field of winter squash. That's a farm that's based in the Leicester area, not too far from our office. The white flowers that you see are buckwheat. So buckwheat is a lovely plant. It's very appropriate for the home garden scale as well. It is an amazing pollinator plant and provides habitat, provides nectar and pollen, and also attracts other beneficial species that help with natural pest control at the farm scale. The other bottom picture that you see there, that again is buckwheat. And buckwheat does great things for our soil, but it really provides just an amazing nectar source, particularly in dry periods. In the hot summers, that's one of the most frequented cover crops that farms use. And it plays a really critical role in making sure that those crops get adequately pollinated and that there's good habitat and food for other organisms as well. Thanks to the World Wide Web and citizen science projects and programs like this through the Master Gardeners and cooperative extension services and nonprofits, luckily there has been a lot of public education about pollinators. The thing to focus on if you're new to the world of insects and pollinators is to just use your observations to gather some initial clues about color and size. The abundance of an organism can often give you clues about what type of pollinator you're looking at. We'll start on the left. We have our fuzzy bumblebee. There's many bumblebee species, but you can gauge that you might have a bumblebee based on the size of the insect. They do tend to be larger pollinators, larger bee species, and they're covered in fine hair, so they're very fuzzy. The monarch butterfly is coupled with honeybees on the far right. Those two are probably our most widely known pollinators. Monarchs, of course, are noted for their miraculous superorganism status and their migration process going from Mexico all the way up through Canada. They're an incredibly unique species for that, and they are under threat. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to support them. And then honeybees, while they are a fantastic pollinator, many of you may know that they are not actually native to North America. They were brought over with the colonists. So they're a European species that has very successfully adapted to life over here in the Americas and throughout the world. But there are some situations where they aren't the primary pollinator that we think about in our native habitats. And so we'll talk about those aspects more in depth. So you may know some of those three pollinators, but today we're going to talk about the larger scope of the pollinator world. And there are so many different types of species. It's important that we start here talking about the characters that we're trying to bring into the garden because they all have different needs and different habitat requirements. Bees are the most important group of pollinators. And the reason is that when they visit flowers, they are seeking nectar and they're seeking pollen. They're seeking pollen because that is what they feed their baby bees so that they can mature and evolve and turn into future generations. Their sole focus when they visit flowers is to collect nectar and pollen, and they do so in wide abundance. They are on a mission when they visit flowers, and they do so with consistency. Part of the reason that they are such amazing pollinators is that they're very dependable for visiting certain types of flowers, the same flower, and ensuring that adequate pollen is moved from one flower to the next. There are literally thousands of bee species in the world, and it can be daunting to think about being able to recognize them all at once. So we can group them into general terms. Honeybees, we've talked about as a European species that we have in abundance here. And of course, they're managed by beekeepers in very controlled ways. Bumblebee species, as I mentioned, are very fuzzy and can be pretty recognizable with that characteristic alone. I'm sure many of you have been familiar with carpenter bees, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in the next few slides. And then there are an entire group of very difficult to identify, very small bees that do a lot of work despite their small size. So the abundance of bees is part of the reason that they are the most important group of pollinators. With the focus on bees, I believe the count now is 560 native bee species in the state of North Carolina that have been documented. And so we want to zoom out from just thinking about honeybees as the important pollinator to focus on when we think about the abundance of all of these other smaller, often overlooked organisms. Why are they overlooked? It's because they behave very differently from honeybees. When I say the word honeybee and you think about what structure they live in. Usually they are in large colonies that are tens of thousands of honeybees. Our native bees are completely different. Many of them are solitary. They build solitary nests. Sometimes they will build solitary nests in aggregation with one another, but they just are not present in large numbers. So that's part of the reason they can easily be overlooked. But there's a wide variety of sizes and colors and shapes of these organisms. Some are very big, bumblebees come to mind, and then some are much, much smaller that you might even need a hand lens to really pick out characteristics. The reason that they are so important is that they can use plants in the landscape and conditions in the landscape that are not as easy for honeybees to navigate through. So when we have cold weather, when we have these dips in the spring, bumblebees, because of their large body size and other large bees, can be active in cooler conditions compared to honeybees. So they really do fill a void in using many of our native plants and our unusual, less desirable climate conditions to get the pollination job done. We won't dive into all of the native bees, the 500 plus species that we have in North Carolina, but there are resources that we'll talk about at the end. If you do want to try to identify them more, we'll give you some resources to start that journey with. But just know that many of these native bee species, when you start to get information about them, oftentimes starting with their common names is a really helpful way to identify them. Luckily, many of their names correspond to behaviors or physical traits that you can identify. We have the leafcutter bee, and we'll talk about that and see some images. That bee gets its name from its behavior of cutting little notches in leaves and taking those pieces of plant material back into their nests and lining their nests with those leaves. There are other bees, the polyester bees, that basically waterproof the inside of their nest, which is unique to that species. Mining bees often nest in the ground out of sight. The bottom picture that you see there, if you have any cucurbit in your garden, if you have zucchini, squash, keep an eye out for something that might look like a honeybee, but it's a little bit smaller, a little bit rounder body shape. The squash bee that you see there is the sole pollinator for those cucurbit species. And so oftentimes you can get to see them right in the thick of your garden. So those are just a quick sampling of some of the native bees that you might see. So of those native bees, we can then further group them based on their nesting habits. Roughly 70% of our native bees nest in the ground, which is another reason they're easily overlooked. We simply don't see them. We're living in the above ground world and we can overlook them. Part of what we'll talk about when we talk about gardening practices is minimizing disturbances to the soil where many of these species live and carry on their nesting and their life cycles. Minimizing tilling and mulching practices, tolerating some level of bare ground so that these species can actually access soil and create their nests. All of those are things that you can do to encourage and support these species. Some of the common species that you may know that do nest in the ground, bumblebees, of course. You may have stumbled upon a nest in the ground. Sometimes they can take over rabbit nests and mouse nests and things that are in the ground. Mining bees, leafcutter bees, and adrenid bees are also ones that nest in the ground. So if 70% of those native bees nest in the ground, where are the other 30%? They are in woody structures or woody stems or logs and stumps found in the forest. Part of the reason we talk about landscape management and leaving things to naturally decompose is that many of those structures do provide important nesting sites for native wood nesting bees. Many of you are probably very familiar with the large carpenter bee, which of course can become a pest if you have wooden structures with your home. You may have some carpenter bee activity and have seen them up close. But out in nature, of course, they do that service, and that's part of the habitat that they need to carry on their life cycle. Other species, mason bees, sweat bees, can also utilize wood nesting structures. So that's the bee portion of the pollinator world. We can also group butterflies and moths into another general category. So these species are less focused on collecting pollen, but they are very focused on collecting nectar. One of the distinguishing characteristics with both butterflies and moths is that they have this long, curled tongue, which is basically used like a straw, and that's how they access tubular flowers and deep flowers to access the nectar that's held deep within the flower structure. In general terms, you can say that butterflies are the organisms that we see flying around during the day. Most of us can easily recognize a butterfly species. We have lots of swallowtails, monarch butterflies, skippers, many different species. Moth species tend to be more nocturnal, but not all. There are some exceptions to that. The middle picture that you see there with the sphinx moth, that's a type of clearwing moth that you can actually see during the day. It's a large moth, almost reminiscent of the behavior that you might see with a hummingbird, where they hover in place as they feed on nectar sources. When you get up close and personal with butterflies and moths, there are some distinguishing characteristics beyond the time of day that you see them. Moths, as you see in the bottom picture there with the giant leopard moth, its wings lay over the body, whereas butterflies' wings, when they're resting and not flying, they tend to be more upright, which you can see in that top picture with the skipper butterfly. Both butterflies and moths, their immature life stage or caterpillar stage plays an important role when we talk about pollinator plants because they're young, the caterpillars oftentimes have to feed on specific types of plants or one specific type of plant in order to complete their life cycle. So we have bees, we have butterflies and moths. We do have a hummingbird pollinator in North Carolina, the ruby-throated hummingbird. There are hundreds of pollinating hummingbirds throughout the Americas. In North Carolina, we have the ruby-throated, and you can see the male in the top picture. The female in the bottom right is feeding on one of our native riparian plants, cardinal flower, which is a type of lobelia. That hummingbird does pollinate lobelia and also trumpet creeper. Sometimes we do get lucky and have vagrant species like the rufous hummingbird in our area as well. But when you move out to the Western and down into the Central and South Americas, there's many more pollination services that these hummingbirds offer. If the hummingbirds are the supermodel of the pollinator world, flies are probably at the other end of the spectrum. They tend to be very small. They tend to be not as flashy in coloration and much smaller in size. But that doesn't mean that they are any less deserving of our awareness as important pollinators. There are thousands of different types of fly species. They, like the butterflies, typically are using and landing on flowers, not for the pollen, but for the nectar sources. Not all, but in general terms, you can say that flies tend to go to white flowers or maroon flowers that are a little bit more drab in coloration. Oftentimes, they'll visit flowers that have an off putting odor, a stinky odor. That's just a characteristic to know when you're out in your landscape looking at those types of flowers. You may be more likely to see fly species rather than some of the other pollinators we mentioned. All flies have one set of wings and they have these really large round eyes. And you can see that in the hoverfly image at the very top. Really large eyes, very short antenna, and typically very small and moving very quickly, like many of these pollinators. Fly pollinators are very important, and part of the reason they are is that they do have an economic influence over many of our agricultural crops. The larvae of many of these fly species are really important biocontrol organisms. The hoverfly that you see in the top picture there, the immature version of that, which is a maggot species, oftentimes they're a light yellow or green. They are voracious predators against aphids and other soft bodied insects. If you're growing in a greenhouse setting, you might do a release of hoverflies to help you battle aphid pressure in a very ecologically sound way. We always want to encourage people to plant pollinator plants in their vegetable gardens and certainly in their agricultural fields to attract some of these natural biocontrols. We also have wasp and beetle pollinators. And compared to bees and butterflies and some of the flies, there's not as much research on the work of pollination services from these types of organisms. But rest assured, they are feeding on pollen and nectar as well. And they are also moving pollen from one flower to the next. These are also species that can be important with many of our native forest species, providing early nectar resources when the spring season is just coming about. When we talk about wasps in particular, they are the carnivores in the insect world. They do huge services for us all with taking care of caterpillar pests that can be problematic on our garden and our agricultural fields. You can see that top picture there in the middle is a wasp species that is voraciously consuming part of a caterpillar that was observed in my garden several years ago. While some of us may have had a negative association with wasps, they do a lot of really important ecological work. So that's another group of species that we want to support with pollinator advocacy and plantings. Lastly, we have a whole group of what we call non insect pollinators, like the hummingbirds. These are larger species that move pollen from one type of plant to the next, resulting in pollination services, mostly for fruits. Some of the economically important plants that you might be familiar with are agave, the saguaro cacti in Arizona is solely pollinated by bats. We don't have great examples here in the Southeast of those species offering pollination services. But when you zoom out into the larger world, these guys do a lot of work with flowers that open at night and flowers that are found in tropical and desert areas. The bottom picture there, that is a species found in Australia, and like many species found in island ecosystems, very unique, very distinct, and endemic to that area. It's a possum species, I believe. You can imagine that in order to pollinate certain types of flowers, those flowers have to be pretty stout. Proteas, which are a cut flower species that some of you may be familiar with, are one species that is pollinated by large organisms like these small mammals here. So that was a quick run through of the different characters that you might see in your gardens and that we'll talk about more as we want to focus on now the plant side of how to attract these plants and species to your garden. So I'll pause quickly to see, Allison, if we've got some questions before we move on to the plant side.
So, just to be sure, the sweat bee is a pollinator?
The sweat bee is a pollinator. There are hoverflies that we all call sweat bees, and then there are actual true sweat bees. One of them is a bee species, one of them is a fly species, but they both do play roles in pollination. They're all tiny, so part of the challenge with identifying some of the sweat bees and the flies is that we tend to overlook them.
There's a question about generalist versus specialist. I
Mhm.
guess that means more about who they visit, how they collect pollen and move.
That's another way to group the native bees or bees in general. Oftentimes, we can lump them just like we lump them into the ground nesting and the wood nesting habitats. That specialist and generalist terminologies, there are some species that, because of their morphology or just their evolutionary movement through time, have become associated with certain types of plants, like the squash bee, for an example. That is a species that focuses on plants in the cucurbit family, and so you could say that that's a specialist. It's not going to be found on the aster that you see in front of us on the slide. Most of our bee species are generalists, meaning that they can forage on a number of different types of species. That helps their health and it helps the health of the overall ecosystem, making sure that all sorts of genetic diversity is being moved around. Let's dive now into what pollinators need in the habitats that we create or that we have naturally on our properties to draw them in and support them further. Like all living organisms, they need some basic requirements. They have to have a food supply, they have to have water, they need shelter, so they need protected places, and then they need spaces to rear the next generation. So we'll go through all of those different aspects in detail. So, when we talk about food for pollinator, we're talking about flowers and what we call floral resources, which basically means pollen and nectar. Those are the things that we are aiming to provide in the landscape. When you are a gardener, your focus is the beauty of flowers and blooming throughout the season. You want things in your landscape and in your garden to enjoy. And that's exactly what pollinators also need. They need flowers from the spring, summer, and fall to provide consistent food sources when we have cooler spring temperatures. Those early flowering plants are critical. Throughout the summer, when we often have drought conditions where things are hot and dry, that is often when they have the bulk of their populations and their young that they're rearing and trying to develop. In the fall, some of these species will need to really power up through late blooming flowers to ensure that they can then carry through the winter and take the torch to the next growing season for their populations. So when we talk about specific plants, I want you to think about what you need or what you may already have in your landscape from spring all the way through fall. In the spring season, luckily, we have a lot of native plants that you may already have. If you are to a new site and you're thinking about bringing in new species, these are some of the most important species for pollinators because of their early bloom time, that early source of nectar and pollen, and their offering of the floral resources that we talked about. In the case of the redbud tree, the bottom green picture with the notches cut out, that's the leaf cutter bee that actually needs to consume pieces of plant material to then line the inside of their nest in order to rear their young. Red maples, service berries, eastern redbuds, many of those are growing naturally in our residential and neighboring areas in our yard and landscapes. Many of us do plant things like blueberries for our enjoyment. Blueberries belong to the genus of Vaccinium, which are just amazing pollination plants. So they offer a lot of floral resources to a host of different organisms. Blue star and false indigo are beautiful early season flowering species. And all of these collectively are ones that do a great deal of offering food and nectar and space, shelter for many of these early season pollinators. I mentioned blueberries in the Vaccinium genus. I think we have about 15 native Vaccinium species that you can often see out in the woods and on high elevation bulbs. All of those species are visited by a number of different types of pollinators, not only honeybees, not only bumblebees, but the southeastern blueberry bee and many of our small native bees, like the sweat bee that Allison just referenced, small carpenter bees. All of those can utilize those tubular flowers and access the nectar and the pollen. In the case of the bumblebees, they are more efficient at pollinating blueberries and vaccinium species because they've got longer tongues to access the pollen and nectar in those flowers compared to honeybees. So, if there is a desire to plant blueberries in your yard or landscape, That's an amazing pollinator plant and will bring in lots of new species for you to hopefully observe. So, as we move into the summer and into the fall seasons, what are the species that we can plant that will continue flowering? So, we think about long bloom time and we think about a variety of flower shapes. These broad flowers, like the coneflower in the top picture and the asters in the bottom, provide a lot of real estate. So, that's going to provide a lot of opportunities for multiple pollinators to access nectar and pollen at one time. If you go out in your garden and you've got coneflowers or asters or other large disc and ray flowers, you'll notice that you might see 5 different pollinators on any one flower. The milkweeds we'll talk about in a moment here, coneflowers, oregano, and mint. All of those in the summer are very hardy species, and so they can tolerate drought conditions once they're established. You don't have to worry about providing them with excess water. You don't have to really worry about them succumbing to drought compared to other non-native species. These are the powerhouse plants that we would love to see in every landscape for those reasons. In the fall, goldenrod and asters provide really important pollen resources and nectar resources at the tail end of the season when we've got these abundant amounts of pollinators in the landscape. Most of us associate milkweeds specifically with the monarch. The monarch caterpillars have to subsist solely on milkweeds in order to mature into the adult butterfly. That's part of the reason that group of plants is so important. And we want you to have as many milkweeds appropriate to your landscape as you can have. That supports not only the monarch butterflies, but many other types of native pollinators. Milkweed species are a really great one to add if you don't already have that in your landscape. There are a lot of different types of milkweeds. Asclepias is the genus of milkweeds. And there are 3 species that are most appropriate for our area. The swamp milkweed is just a very lovely, fragrant pink flower. Butterfly weed is this beautiful yellow flower that you see here. It does have a taproot, and so it is very drought tolerant and drought hardy. And then the common milkweed that you see on the far right is another lovely smelling species. All of these are ones that, if you have in your landscape or want to add, you will know that you're supporting monarchs specifically, but also the larger ecosystem of pollinators that are out there in your landscape. Some of the other big hitters, oreganos. There's many different cultivars of oreganos. Sweet marjoram also is another plant related to oreganos that has abundant flowers. They can tolerate a lot of really harsh growing conditions, including drought, and they provide ample nectar and pollen resources. This is one plant that if you walk up in the middle of the summer, you will see a dizzying amount of pollinator activity. So that's a really great one to add to your landscape. And then we have mint varieties. Many of you may be thinking of spearmint and apple mint and many of those types of cultivars, but we have native mint species, the Pycnanthemum genus, that are some of the most abundant pollinator attracting plants in the landscape. They are mints, and some of them can spread by rhizome, so you want to plan them carefully, plant them in areas where they do have some room to spread. But it is amazing the amount of pollinator activity that you will see. They have a long bloom time, and they are also very drought tolerant, so that's a really good species to add and draw in a lot of pollinators without having to tend greatly to those plants. So in the summer window, moving into the fall, we then think about goldenrod and aster species. Goldenrods often get blamed for our seasonal allergies in the fall. They do provide a lot of pollen, but that pollen is not windborne. So the hay fever that you might associate with goldenrod is actually usually caused by ragweed, which is a windblown pollen source. Goldenrod has a very long late season bloom time, and it provides a number of different proteins and minerals for our late season pollinators. So the monarch that you see on that particular goldenrod in front of you is getting ready to migrate down to central Mexico. That's a long journey. None of us humans could probably make that trek, but these butterflies have to fill up on all sorts of nectar and pollen reserves in order to make that journey south. When we have bee species that overwinter as queens, the queen is protected by a small group of other species. All of those guys going into winter need to be as healthy and robust as possible before hibernation, winter dormancy. So these late blooming fall plants are very important to have in the landscape. Goldenrods also provide really important habitat and space and shelter for types of native flies that create that gall that sometimes you see on goldenrod plants. Many of the wood nesting bees that we talked about, the very small native bees, will also utilize goldenrod stems for their nesting habitat. So, goldenrod really is a foundational landscape plant to have, not only for the floral resources that it provides, but also the nesting habitat. Goldenrods, I forget how many species there are, but there are probably hundreds of different Solidago species, and some are more appropriate for your landscape than others. So pay attention to the specific species when you're adding landscape goldenrod. I made the mistake several years ago of acquiring several different types of goldenrod from a neighborhood plant offering and plant swap. I have some of these tamer goldenrod species that behave very nicely in the landscape. And then I have some that don't behave. There are some species that are colonizers that spread by rhizomes and can outcompete other plants in your landscape. So if you have a large backyard, natural area, maybe you have some acreage on your property, those are the types of scales that would be appropriate for some of these other types of goldenrod species, like the gray goldenrod and the tall goldenrod. Those are a little bit more difficult to contain in the residential scale. As I mentioned, asters also are a really important group of plants, late blooming, continual blooming. They'll bloom up until frost, and they also are extremely drought tolerant, most of the varieties. One of the other thing that's really nice about asters is that they come in all sorts of different cultivars and shades. They can be purple, blue, lavender, white. They're very adaptive species. There are species that can handle your shady areas, your wet areas, and then there are also species that can handle drought, very dry soils, and bright full sun. Typically, the more sun you have, the more pollinator activity you'll get to see. But I think if it were me, if I only had one plant to pick in the landscape that really was abundant with pollinator activity, I have the Tartarian aster that you see in the bottom there. That is in front of my front porch. And so in the fall, it's just amazing to see how many different species are just coming and going with pollen and nectar resources there. So that's a really important plant to have. Again, it's going to support not only the bee species, but many of our caterpillar and moth species as they are getting ready for their pupation time or their overwintering lifespan to build for the next season. We mentioned a little bit about the monarch and how the caterpillars feed solely on milkweeds as their host plant in order to mature and turn into adults. There are many caterpillar species that also are pretty specialized with the types of plants that they have to be feeding on in order to mature. Some of our native plants that are worth consideration in your landscape are spice bush, which is a host plant for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly that you see on the top right there. That's the caterpillar form. With all caterpillar host plants, in order for that species to come to maturity, it's going to need to eat that plant material. So leaves are going to be eaten, not to the point that it will kill those plants. That's part of the coevolution of those species. But just know that if you plant caterpillar host plants, you are going to see some plant damage or some removing of plant material. The redbud is another host plant, blueberries, as we mentioned, and some of our holly species are host plants for the Henry's elfin, one of our cute little butterflies. And then the American lady. These are just a few examples of the many hundreds of caterpillar species that rely upon host plants to evolve and go through their life cycle. So if you are wanting to support pollinators as a whole, it's often really helpful to include some of these host plants so that you get to enjoy all of the life stages and not just the adult form of the pollinator. A few cautions about choosing plants for the landscape. Right now, the multiflora rose is at the tail end of its blooming season, and while it has a delightful smell to it, it's a really problematic invasive plant. And many of our native plants will flower. They have showy flowers. Sometimes they are nice smelling flowers, but they don't provide the same level of nutrition that our native plants offer. And of course, there's also the problem of when they are able to take over landscapes and produce abundant seed, then that can create all sorts of ecological havoc in the landscape. So it's not to say that you won't ever see pollinators on something like multiflora rose, but if you were standing next to a native holly species when it's in bloom, you can literally stand underneath that holly and almost feel the vibration of all the hundreds and thousands of pollinators that are feeding on that holly species in bloom. You can walk up to a multiflora rose that's in full bloom and spend 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds before you see any pollinator visit that flower. That's giving you a really important clue that the multiflora rose and some of our other invasive plants just don't provide the same amount or quality of floral resources that our native plants offer. There are also species or cultivars of some of our recommended pollinator plants, like Echinacea. Echinacea, many of the cultivars are wonderful and provide ample nectar and pollen resources. And then there are cultivars that have been bred over time for certain plant characteristics. So, this double yellow flower that you see on the right is a variety of Echinacea that's bred to be a double Echinacea, but there's no way that a pollinator can access floral resources in that plant. Is it a beautiful flower? Of course, it's a beautiful, stunning cultivar, but it does not allow floral resources to be attained by pollinators. That's not to say you can't have those plants in your landscape, but try to focus more on those plants that are going to be offering nectar and pollen resources. So that's the food portion of the pollinator habitat. Let's talk a little bit more about the other aspects that we want to bring into the landscape. Many of our waterways do not look abundant and full of water right now due to the drought situation. But if you are nearby a creek or a river or an intermittent wet zone, wetland area, then you've got water that pollinators can utilize. They will sip water. They are living organisms. They have to have water to subsist. Much of the nectar that they consume, of course, also has water in it, but it's also helpful, particularly in drought times, to provide supplemental water sources for all organisms. If you're lucky enough to have surface water, a pond, a creek, or river near you, then you may not need to worry too much about providing water. But in the backyard landscape, if you really want to see pollinator activity and support the pollinators in your specific zone, then you can add things like bird baths. Small depression collection areas will be utilized by pollinators as they're seeking water when we have drought situations like we have now. So just make sure that you've got some level of water there. Mosquitoes, we always get questions about mosquitoes when we have standing water. So, of course, you can prevent those with the mosquito dunks. That won't impact your pollinator species. But also, just freshening that water source is a really good idea, just like we would want to have fresh water sources. Shelter is really important. When we talk about shelter, think about spaces that are safe and protected for organisms. That could be a lawn area and an adjacent kind of wild border so that when you are mowing your yard and there's clover blossoms in that yard, the mower's coming towards those clover blossoms. If you're a bee foraging on that clover, you're going to need an escape route. You're going to need a protected buffer zone to escape to while that mowing is occurring or while that tilling is occurring. And then you can come back after that disturbance has left. And so field borders are really important. We talk about that a lot with our farmers. But even in the backyard scale, you can have a floral buffer zone that's not only beautiful, but it creates a lot of different surface area and space for pollinators and other organisms to forage in and to escape from predation in. We talked about ground nesting bees and wood nesting bees and how leaving stumps and logs and stems can be really useful to provide shelter for these organisms. We didn't talk in great detail about the ground nesting bees, but many of those ground nesting bees do prefer sandy habitats. They need to access some level of bare soil in order to create those nests. So if you've got rocks in your landscape, you might notice there's little holes amidst the rocks. That can be a protected space for ground nesting bees to escape and build their nests in. So, as you were looking back in your landscape moving forward, try to identify some of those areas that you can leave to create shelter and habitat for these organisms. There are lots of different types of artificial shelters out there, and this is more appropriate for the wood nesting bees that are naturally going to look for spaces in wooden materials. One of the things to note about these structures, they're a great way to bring pollinator awareness into school systems and backyards and general public spaces, but they do have to be maintained. Just like we need to clean our house and make sure that things are clean, these are structures that you want to replace at least every 2 years so that disease pathogens don't build up and you're not creating a situation where you might be leading to more harm than good. It's also helpful to have these structures near areas where there's already flowering plants. So you want to be attracting those pollinators in with those floral resources and then direct them that you've got some sheltering spots for them as well. We mentioned that stems in the garden can also be really important. The plants that I mentioned earlier they're all perennials, and so they create perennial stems. Many of those species, like the goldenrod, create structures that these pollinators can utilize for nests and raising their young. Hollow stems can be excavated, very protected sites for the bee larvae to develop into mature insects. We have about 100 species in North Carolina that have to have some sort of stem to nest in. You can provide those stems by selecting certain types of plants that we mentioned earlier. So they will not harm those living stems, but instead they utilize the dead stems from last season and excavate that inside material and then create their nests from that space. At the end of the growing season, this fall or this winter, rather than cutting down all the stems to ground level and creating this nice, tidy zone, we would prefer for pollinator habitat for you to leave up to 2 feet of stem material above those plants because those stems will provide critical habitat and sheltering spaces and spaces for those native bees to raise next year's young in the hollow of those stems. That's a gardening trick that I am retraining myself in my landscaping behavior to make sure that I'm doing what I can to support those native pollinators. So I hope that you can aim for that as well. In general terms, when you want to plant for pollinators, for shelter and food and places to raise their young, the more species you have blooming at one time, the more attractive your site will be for these pollinators. When you plant in masses, that can also be more of a waving flag for them to come to your landscape. It helps them identify and orient to your site better, and ultimately helps you have more beauty and more pollinator activity to observe. You don't solely have to use native plants. It is a really good idea to plant a lot of natives, but you can certainly blend in some of the non native species and other cultivars that we talked about. The big practice to talk about is minimizing or fully avoiding use of pesticides. Pesticides are designed to harm living insects. Usually there's a pest issue that you're trying to address. But pesticides are toxic, right? They are designed to harm living organisms and they can harm what we call non target organisms. So you may have some aphids out on your tomato plants. But if you spray that tomato plant with a pesticide, and 2 days later, a bee comes and visits that plant, depending on what material you use, that bee could be harmed because of your pesticide activity. Now, horticultural oil and insecticidal soap and some of the contact insecticides that are only effective when they are sprayed on an organism, those can be a better option if you do have to spray. But just like the conventional pesticides can be harmful to pollinators, many of the organic pesticides can also be harmful. So, on the home garden scale, unless you're really utilizing your food production for your livelihood, I think it's a really good aim to just avoid pesticides at all cost. There are many other gardening tricks that you can use, barriers, physical hand removal to address some of these pest problems without risking the pollinator disturbance. I mentioned that we will provide a list of resources in a follow up email to all of you. But I just want to point out that there are some really amazing resources to dive in deeper to pollinator health and habitat and biology. There are a number of different plant lists out there that are useful. We are blessed to have Bee City USA that was founded in Asheville. That's a great resource. Their website has a lot of appropriate plant lists that are useful. The Xerxes Society is wonderful for all things insects. So there's a lot of useful tools there for land managers and farmers, as well as backyard scale folks that want to really improve and expand pollinator habitat. And then there are several North Carolina state extension resources that I would highly recommend if you are interested in learning how to identify some of the pollinators, some of the native bees in your landscape. The Bees of North Carolina, that ID guide that Hannah Levinson and Elsa Youngstead produced several years ago, is a wonderful resource. I use it every season when I see things in my landscape that I can't fully recall the name. I go to the reference book. It's very easy to use, wonderful images. I highly recommend that resource. And then, not fully specific to pollinators, but there are 3 publications that offer plant lists and garden practices that translate into successful pollinator habitats. So, the Landscaping for Wildlife with Native Plants, Butterflies in Your Backyard, and the bird focused backyard gardening book. All of those are resources through NC State that you can access online that can give you some very detailed information beyond what we've talked about today. If you're more focused on butterflies and moths, this resource is a wonderful site for looking at images. It functions largely as like an open source citizen science page. So, with that, I'm happy to answer any burning questions about any of the plant side or any other new questions that may have popped up.
There was a question about mountain mint, and if you had any tricks of keeping it within bounds.
Selecting the proper species. When you get a copy of this presentation, there are some species that are a little bit more tame than others, but in general, they are mints. So they do have spreading rhizomes. One of the practices, I do have it in a small residential landscape in my yard. And so that means that I regularly pull it through the growing season to keep it within its bounds. But the easiest thing is to just site it in a larger space so that you can just let it naturalize and spread out.
Somebody mentioned Tithonia or Mexican sunflower. It's an
Mhm.
annual, not native for us, but is that good for pollinators?
That's a wonderful pollinator species. Yeah, that's going to be providing mostly nectar resources, but some pollen as well. And it is one that can have a lot of real estate, so to speak, as far as its habit. So that's always great. You can have an abundance of flowers, meaning you can then have an abundance of pollinator activity.
It gets quite big, but has a long bloom season. You were talking about bare soil when you were talking about shelter and some of the elements. Does it need to be dry?
My gut is telling me it needs to be sandier soils. Heavy clay, wet soils are going to be harder for some of those ground nesting bees to excavate. But there's many different species of ground nesting bees. The sites that I tend to see more activity are drier and do have a little bit larger soil particles than some of our heavy clays.
Megan, thank you so much for being with us today. So grateful for all you do for us and our farmers in Buncombe County. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.